My name is Tim Hutchison. I'll be your MC for the evening. It's another cold and cloudy night here in Pittsburgh, so I'm glad to be here with you all. Thank you for coming back to the program or showing up for the first time if this is your first time here. Please do remember to like and subscribe. That certainly helps the channel and helps our outreach. We have a really terrific program for you tonight. Tonight we have my friend Gary Imm on the program. Gary is an amateur astrophotographer who has retired to Onalaska, Texas. I can't talk tonight. And he took up the hobby of astrophotography 7 years ago. He enjoys imaging deep sky objects, particularly the small and obscure ones. Gary says his greatest asset is his patient and understanding wife. If any of you are like me, you start your morning off with a hot cup of coffee and looking at Gary's latest post for the night before and reading his terrific description. So I think we all know who Gary is. He probably needs no introduction to you, and he's got something really great to share with us tonight. So Gary, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Great, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I just want to welcome the audience here. I know we've got people from around the globe, and especially those of you from outside the US who are either late at night or early in the morning. I really appreciate that. I'll try to make it worth your time. I'm going to give you a short overview first. I've got about 7 PowerPoint slides to show. I will talk about, tonight is about my compendium, which I first talked about a year ago. We're on the 4th revision now. And I'm going to talk about the 2 main components. One is the PDF ebook. I'll spend a few minutes on that, but we're going to spend most of the time tonight talking about the planning spreadsheet. And I'm on it's the piece that's had the most major revisions here in the last few months. I'm going to go at a fairly quick pace through this. It'll be posted in the next day or two, the video, so you can go through that maybe a bit slower. But I do have a lot of content. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. Feel free to send me any questions by my email, which is in the compendium. I'll be happy to answer those. And then tonight, please post your questions in the thread there on YouTube. I cannot see the comments or questions, but Tim and Alex and the crew here is going to compile those, and then I'll stop periodically and answer for those questions. And those questions are very useful because it's not just questions, it's also last year we also had a number of requests for features that I was able to fold into some of the most recent releases of the compendium. So with that, let me just start quickly with just a bit of history. As Tim said, I've been doing this for 7 years. I posted about 2,200 images on Astrobin, which has been about 10,500 hours of night sky time. And I'm obsessed with trying to utilize every clear sky minute that I have. And to do that requires a lot of planning. So I started using planning tools that most of you are probably familiar with, like Astro Planner, Telescopius, Stellarium, and various other methods, and they all work okay. But over the years, I collected a ton of data, collected a ton of images, and started to put together my own tool just for my own use. And then a few years ago, I said, well, it probably would make sense to try to make that available for free to the public. And so that's what I've done now for over a year. It's on the 4th release. The purpose of that compendium is simply to help the astrophotographer find targets in the night sky that are interesting. My friends over the years have said, Gary, I've got the equipment set up, it's a clear night, and then I image one object, and the next one I'm not really sure I should image. So you really need to make the most use of not only your primary time, but also if clouds come up on the southern half of the sky, you need to have targets on the northern half. So it's useful to have a robust planning tool, I think, to help you make every moment count out there. It's on the 4th revision. I just incorporated, I say we don't have a big staff here, it's just me. I've incorporated now the Mac, so I've had a number of requests for that. I bought a Mac and converted all the macros to the Mac. So I'll give you the download links of that in a second. So with that, before I stop for the first batch of questions, I'm going to go through a few quick slides here. I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint, and hopefully this will be hopefully you can see that. Can I have confirmation? Tim, are you able to see that?
Yeah, it looks great, Gary.
Okay, great. So this is, like I said, this is the 4th edition. Last year I gave a talk at this exact Astro Imaging Forum on the initial release. So we've had, this is the 4th revision, and really it's to the point now, the compendium's to the point where it's satisfied most of the goals I set out when I started. So I don't have any major plans for next year, but one of the purposes of tonight is to try to gather some input to see what the rest of you think, how it's being used, and if there's anything else I should try to incorporate into that compendium. So again, this is just a description. As I've said, the purpose is to help astrophotographers find interesting deep sky targets. It's a free download. I'll give you the links here in a second. The compendium consists of 2 components. One is an ebook, or basically a PDF file, and that asks the question, what objects do I want to image? So it gives you a bunch of objects, thousands of different targets, images, and data, and lets you walk through those, all of that data in different ways, in terms of catalogs, in terms of different slices, and I'll show that to you here in a minute. The spreadsheet's a little bit different. It says, well, of those objects that I want to image, what are currently available for me to image tonight? So it'll give you a view into what the best targets will be at your location with respect to the moon position for that date over the next 6 or 8 hours. And the purpose of that, of course, is to help you plan your imaging sessions and pick the best targets. So 2 things I wanted to mention there at the bottom. One is both documents are standalone documents. In other words, they do have links to data that will complement what you see in the documents, but they are standalone in the sense you can just take those outside or out to the field and use those. They do not need an internet connection to work. Second, both are very similar in structure. And I know that's a very vague statement. What that means is that in the ebook, for example, if you're looking for a certain type of object, say you want to look at super thin galaxies and you see the poster there, super thin galaxies, and you find a few you want to image, all you have to do is go to the spreadsheet and click on the button that says super thin galaxies, and it'll bring up all of those as potential targets for you. And same thing with the Abell Planetary Nebula Collection. You go into the ebook and you see planetary nebula there you want to image. You just click on that button in the spreadsheet and it'll bring those up to you. And I'll walk you through that here in just a minute. These are the major changes here in the last month for the 4th edition. Like I said, it runs it both now on Mac and Windows. The entire sky is now covered. The initial release just had basically the northern hemisphere down to about -40. And so now we've got both northern and southern hemispheres included. So there's over 3,100 objects included, which I think are the best objects in the night sky. Each object has been rated for its imaging potential from 0 to 5. So a 5 means it's in the top 2% of targeted images for astrophotography. 4 means it's in the top 10%. A 3 means it's in the top 25%. A 2 is basically an average object. 1 is for hardcore imagers only, and a 0 is an object that you would never, ever want to image. And of course, you're going to ask the question, well, Gary, why would you include an object that has a rating of 0 in your compendium? And the reason is that I wanted to make the catalogs complete. So there's catalogs in there, like the Barnard Dark Nebula catalog or the Sharpless catalog. And not all of those, and there's just a bunch of different catalogs I've included, and not all of those catalog entries are worth imaging, in my opinion. So they get 0. So I've included them, but I made it clear that that's probably not something that should be pursued. So we'll go through that here in a second. Each of the objects has a mouse over image, which you can quickly look at, a low resolution image in the spreadsheet. They all have hyperlinks to Sinbad and Aladdin. We'll go through that. In addition, most of them have hyperlinks to a high resolution image. There's a brief description for each object. For most of the emission nebula, there's a relative comparison of the narrowband signal strengths for each narrowband channel, SHO. So for example, most of it's normalized to hydrogen because that's going to be the maximum signal. And I'll show that sulfur may range from 5% to 20% of that. Oxygen may range from 5% to 40%. And once you know those relative signal strengths, you can do a better job of first of all, collecting the data and then using that for a palette. So as an example, if you've got a narrowband signal strength in a channel like sulfur that's 10% or less, it's going to be really hard for you just to assign those SHOs to the red, green, and blues and get a decent image. You're going to have to do some hybrid mixing there. We'll talk more about that in a second. I'm not going to go through the rest of them here. But you can do that in the video that'll be posted later if you want to see what the changes all have been. So now just to briefly go over the two before I dive into the ebook. The ebook, it's a PDF, simple PDF file, 456 pages, 2,600 object images. You don't need any special software to look at the ebook, just a PDF reader. As you'll see here in a minute when I show you the PDF file, make sure that you enable the bookmarks, which are going to be typically in the left column of a PDF reader. And for content, this is the content. The top 100 targets is at the start of the ebook. Then I have 10 complete catalogs and 26 catalogs in total, which will show you either the complete catalog of images or various selected images, which in my opinion are the best objects in that catalog. And then there's 47 collections, and that's not a great word to use, but it's basically different slices of objects. They might be things like grand spiral galaxies. They might be things like owl-type planetary nebula, or it might be super thin galaxies or edge-on galaxies or whatever. So the purpose of this ebook is to help you find interesting targets. And once you've been through kind of the major catalogs, like the Messier catalog or Caldwell, you're gonna have an affinity. You're gonna start looking for different types of images. You might want to image a grand spiral galaxy, and that's where these collections come in handy. It'll give you a pictorial of all of the best grand spiral galaxies to image. Now the spreadsheet is different. This has 3,100 unique objects. Each line of the spreadsheet has 31 pieces of data for each object. And a couple of key points here: you have to have Excel to run this sheet. It'll work on macro windows. I've had numerous requests to be able to run this on something like Google Spreadsheets or some free software, but none of those free software packages are able to run all of the VBA macros that are required to do all the scientific calculations to calculate where all of these objects are in the sky at any point in time. I'm still, trying to get that to work because it really would be nice to make this available. So my product is free here. Be nice to be able to run it on a free software. Right now, I pay $70 a year for Office 365, and that's what you're going to have to do too if you don't have access to that. There's cheaper ways to get Excel, and I've used that in the past. But I found actually Office 365 runs faster than some of the older versions of Excel I used to run, and I've been pretty happy with that. And of course, it gives you access to other things other than Excel. The compendium spreadsheet part of it, as we've talked about, identifies the best objects each night. We'll go over that. I'm not going to talk too much about the rest of this because we'll talk about that as I get into the spreadsheet. But this at the bottom shows you just a screenshot of what the spreadsheet looks like. These are the download links. So these are free downloads. The book's about 45 megabytes. The spreadsheet's about 30 megabytes. And the easiest way is from my homepage, which is www.garyimm.com. Also, for those of you that are on Astrobin, and you can just easily get to my site, and the first thing you'll see on there is a link to get to the compendium. And then if you search Cloudy Nights, you'll be able to find it on there as well. So either of those, it's all the same. You want to look for the fourth revision, and within that revision, I'm on version I right now, but that's not terribly important. I have minor releases basically each week just to do some minor corrections. I'm not going to talk about these before you begins. You can read those if you look at the posted video later, but I'm going to go over that, each of those here later. And then finally, the compendium's free. If you find it to be useful, you can consider, I'd ask you to consider a small donation to a scholarship fund I've set up for astronomy students. It's a tax-deductible donation account, and 100% of the funds raised go to scholarship recipients. I've raised over $4,000 so far, and the first scholarship awards will be in the second quarter of next year. I hope to do that for multiple years, as long as I can kind of swing that. I'm trying to do the best we can to develop the next generation of astronomers. So with that, I'm going to just take a quick stop. Tim, is there any questions that you have at this point?
Gary?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, let's see, something just popped up. This is from Nick. Does the program show you what the DSL looks like with your particular field of view, position angle, like CCD Navigator does? Can it create an imaging session for acquisition software?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm very familiar with the field of view. It does not do that. It does not replicate what the field of view is for different sizes. So it does not do that. And then the second question was what again?
Does it generate an imaging session for any acquisition software?
No, it does not do that. I have not really provided an interface here for either, running a telescope. Like, for example, there are definitely some software packages out there that can do that, but this is pretty much a standalone product. So I can't automatically export a target list that would be picked up by ASCOM or some related connected setup.
But it does give dimensions of the object. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, we'll see all that here in a second.
So that's pretty much like a field of view.
And it does tell us where we would want to, where the object is centered. And so we can walk over to Sequence Generator Pro or any of the others that do just what Nick is talking about and have them frame it for our session.
And that's what I usually do. I use Sequence Generator Pro a lot. So that's what I do. So it really depends. I mean, every tool like this, it's got its benefits, pluses and minuses. And so you just have to look at what's offered and see how you might be able to use it in your own process that you use.
Okay, I think that's the only question, Gary.
Okay, well, I'm going to dive real quickly. I'm trying to get through all of this preliminary stuff so I can get to the compendium itself. So I do want to dive into the PDF here. So I'm going to bring that up. And this is what it looks
You got
like.
to share your screen again, Gary?
Oh, yeah. Here we go. So is that better?
Yep, you're perfect.
We're all set.
Okay, so there's two parts to the compendium. The first part, as I said, is an ebook or a PDF file. This is the PDF file. It's 450 pages. And the first thing you're going to want to do when you download it is try to enable a view of the bookmark. So I know you can't read this very well at your screens that you're looking at, but on the left column is a column that I've bookmarked of all the important pages through the document. And what you want to do is right click on that and expand those bookmarks as much as you can so you can see the whole thing. Now there's also links in the document, so I'll show you what I mean. If I click on table of contents over here, you'll see the table of contents. So in the table of contents, I can go down and click on any of these links. So it has the same functionality, but on the left column, it's just a whole lot easier to be flying through these bookmarks over here. At least that's what I find. So I'm going to take a few of the, I'm not going to go through the introductory pieces of the PDF, PDF file. I will take you through a few of the pieces just to show you its utility. So if you click on the top targets, each of these sections that I show you, whether it's a catalog or a collection, will have a text section that's 1 to 2 pages, which introduces what you're about to see. So this is the text section here. It talks about what you're looking at. And then it follows it up with the images themselves. Now the images are what I would call medium resolution. You can zoom in as I'm doing here, and it's not terrible, but it's not something you're going to want to print and put on the wall, but it'll give you a feel for what those documents look like. And that's all I was trying to do here, is give you a feel when you're going through here, is this something I want to image or not? So this chapter is all on the top 100 images. And so each section has the initial text I mentioned, it has the images, and then at the end it'll have, for each image that's shown, it'll show some abbreviated data about that object. And now this is just a fraction of what's in the spreadsheet I'm about to show you, but it'll have the nickname, the type of object, the size of the object, the right ascension, declination, transit, and the constellation. And then a link over here that takes you to Astrobin, where you can get a whole lot more data. I will show you how that links works in a second when we get to the spreadsheet itself. But if I go back here to the table of contents, what we were just looking at is the top 100. So that's simply the 100 targets I think are the best 100 targets. I then have 26 different catalogs listed, some of them complete, others not. Messier, for example, is complete. So you can see I've got these classic catalogs which have multiple different types of object, galaxy catalogs, so ARP's complete, Hickson's complete, and so on. And then planetary nebula. So for example, I'll take you to this one. This shows you the Abell planetary nebula catalog. And you can see the different Abell objects here. And, you know, even if you're not going to image these objects, I think it's kind of fun and insightful to look at what they look like compared to each other, because there are quite a few similarities between these planetary nebula, quite a few differences. And you can use this to try to go through and try to pick out what objects that you might want to, you know, take a closer look at or image. These are all images I have taken. So, you know, at the end of the day, whatever you're able to achieve here won't be that far off of what these images look like. So if I take you back, now I'm going to take you to this is the page that actually shows in detail all different catalogs. So this table here has the name of the catalog, the object type, the focus of the catalog, the author of the catalog, the date, and these last two columns are important. The last column is how many objects are in the catalog in totality, and then the second to last is how many objects are actually shown in this PDF. So you can see here clearly some of them are shown in totality, others aren't. You know, for example, the Abell large cluster catalog has 4,073, and I just picked the best 25 to show. So this will show you the various catalogs, and you know, one of the ones I wanted to show is the Sharpless catalog. So if you go to the Sharpless one, which is this one here, now you can see there's 313 total, and I'm only showing 64. I just picked what I thought were the best 64 for this ebook. And what I've done is I've shown them by palette. So I've got one poster that has the nebula that I think are best imaged in the show palette, or some aspect of what I would call a full narrowband palette. You know, you could say HOS or show. And you can tell just by the colors that those are the full palette. So that's one page of the full palette. Then I've got another page that are just HOO, which is leaving out the sulfur here. And these are primarily planetary nebula or supernova remnants. So it's a useful device, because if you try to, for example, image some of these objects in full show, you might get some signal there from sulfur, but most of the time it's just going to be probably not a productive use of your time. At least that's what I found. And then the third are just hydrogen. So here, the other two channels, both oxygen and sulfur, are pretty weak. And so at least for your initial image, I would start. Now I have imaged some of these here, like Sharpless 229 with full narrowband, and it works out okay. And same with the California nebula. But for most of these, and the same with the Seagull. So it's not to say you couldn't do these with full narrowband, but in many of these cases, the hydrogen is just a very dominant aspect of that channel. So that just shows you, you know, kind of a snapshot into one of the catalogs. So those are the catalogs. There's also these collections I had mentioned, and this gives you an idea for the galaxy. And then there's 35 galaxy collections. This is showing the feature, that's the subject of the collection, the type of collection, and the number of examples in the poster. So for example, I'll show you grand design spirals. So I picked the text introduction here. Now, grand design spirals are face-on spiral galaxies that have amazing structure. And the most interesting part of grand design spiral galaxies is that they're symmetric. So for example, on this page, I've turned each of them 180 degrees and put them next to each other. And obviously for M51, you can kind of tell that I've done that because of the companion. But for many of them, you know, they almost look the same once you turn them 180 degrees, which I think is amazing. They have such a massive structure, look almost identical when you turn it 180 degrees. But again, these are very interesting objects to image, and so I put them all on this page for grand design spirals, because these are large face-on galaxies with a lot of structure that if you're looking for something interesting to image, I find these to be fun ones to image. Now, if you do want to image a grand design spiral, you can go to the spreadsheet I'm about to show you, click on the grand design spiral button, and it'll bring all these up and show you where in the sky they are for that night. So those are all the galaxies and all of the, you can see the different characteristics in this collection. So it ranges from different structures. So what I just showed you was grand design spirals, but I have different structures like hexagons, shells, bar lines, VV rows, rings. I love rings. There's collisional rings and polar rings and nuclear rings. And then all different kinds of merger types with loops and tails and disturbances and so on and so forth. So those are galaxies. And then I have a collection page for planetary nebula. And not as many different types here, just because I haven't been able to figure out how to slice planetary nebula in as many different ways. You know, but there are some interesting ones here. And then finally, what I call star-related collections, which are all star features like asterisms, globular clusters, things like young stellar objects. This is interesting if you have a longer focal length scope, because these are objects that change year to year depending on the shadows and the young stars that are forming out of dust clouds. And so a lot of these are variable nebula that change year to year and are interesting to image objects as well. At the very end of the 450-page ebook is an object table that has each object that's been shown in the table with some additional data that you can go through. Again, that's a bit of a simplified version of what I'm about to show you next, which is the spreadsheet. So that concludes what I wanted to show out of the ebook. And if there's no questions that I need to stop for, Tim, I'm just going to plow right ahead into the compendium itself, the spreadsheet.
Gary?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is one question. You kind of covered it, but maybe you could just review it. How did you come up with your 0 to 5 rating? Just qualitative, or was there some measurement? Or scientific wild ass guess?
Yeah, it's science at its best. You know, the luxury of being the sole author on a document like this is that you know, you have the freedom to make those kind of decisions. So yeah, it was just my judgment. If you look back on Astrobin, I have done my top 100 objects forever, and it changes sometimes. And so, I had a pretty good clue. I've also looked at many books. I probably on my shelf here, I've got 3 or 4 different books of the top 100 objects for both Southern and Northern Hemisphere. So I gathered a lot of information. I started with those lists. And so I would say, the top 2% and the top 10% were pretty easy because everybody has those top lists. It was a little harder to go into the top 25, and that's where I started just to rely on my judgment over the years of my images, the ones I liked best and the ones I thought were most spectacular. And then I started to put them in different buckets, and I would just look at the 4s versus the 3s and make sure there wasn't any I wanted to move up or down. So it was just my call on that. So much of the data you'll see here, and a good example is the orientation of the galaxies. I could not find galaxy orientation anywhere in terms of a consistent piece of data for every one of the 1,500 galaxies I've got in the compendium. So I had to do all that myself. So that was a little more on the scientific side. So some of the data that you see in there is, like the visual magnitudes are from databases I was able to find, but a lot of it, like the channel signal strengths for narrowband, or, the rating for the objects, or the galaxy orientations are things that I just came up with on my own.
Now, you had a number called size in one of the earlier tables a few slides ago. What was the size number from?
Most of those size numbers, so I'm not, without trying to sound like a jerk or anything, I've had so much bad information over the years from even places like Sinbad that ultimately I just went back to all of my images to get size information.
So was it based on some scale? I think, was it an arbitrary scale? You have like 10, 50?
Well, it's just all based on like arc seconds and arc minutes. I mean, it's based on the actual apparent size of the object. Now, the only piece of data that, well, I shouldn't say the only piece, but one of the main pieces of data that still has a lot of variability that I couldn't do anything about, as you'll see in the spreadsheet, is the distance. So distance is a very hard one to nail down. In Sinbad, you'll see distance measurements for the same object vary by 10% up or down, maybe 20, 30% year to year. It's just crazy if you look at how historically distances have changed. So when I use the apparent size and the distance to calculate the actual size in light years, because in my compendium I show both the apparent size in arc minutes and the actual size in light years, the actual size is going to be dependent on the distance measurement. So if one day they decide that this galaxy is twice as close as what we think, it's going to be twice as small in a way. So that those numbers are all linked. But to answer your question about apparent size, I scaled all of that off of my images, which should be pretty accurate.
And while we're talking, 2 more questions came up. Have you imaged everything in the compendium?
Yes, everything in the PDF file I've imaged. Now, when and everything in the spreadsheet, which is 2,250 objects, I've imaged down to -50 latitude. So if it was between -50 and -90 South Pole, I haven't been to the South Pole or I haven't been to South America yet. So I used Sky Atlas images, and you'll see that. So those images are not as good in the mouse overs, you know, in the spreadsheet. Those images are not as good a quality, but you'll still get a feel for what the object looks like.
And the last question is, are there any other catalogs that you plan to include in the future?
Yeah, well, you know, most those of you that follow me on Astrobin may know that I just finished the Hickson catalog, which was a bit of a chore. The ARP catalog was the hardest. So, you know, I would say what I really need to do is go and clean up some things. So I really don't have a complete VDB catalog for reflection nebula. I really haven't done a good job with the Sharpless catalog. So the problem with those objects is that you can have one object like the Seagull Nebula that could have a bunch of different Sharpless and VDB objects. So I need to go through carefully all my images and figure out how much of those collections I actually have, and then clean those up a bit. But in terms of new catalogs, right now I don't have any plans for that.
Is the last part of that question, I guess, is there going to be an Imm catalog?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Oh,
No, my skill is in compiling things, not necessarily in, you know, finding or creating them.
Alex, you have a question?
yeah, it was all the way back on the your rating system, and I think the 0 or is it a 1 that is said don't even bother taking these pictures. How does one qualify? How does a object qualify for that? At what point do you say, "Hey, forget about it, guys"?
Well, you know, you kind of learn over. So in my opinion, Aladdin, the Sky Atlas tool, is a great tool, not because it gives you great images, but because you can kind of extrapolate from what you see there. So I have tried to image some dark nebula that I couldn't really hardly see in Aladdin, and they did not turn out at all. Basically, nothing showed up. I mean, it was shadows. And so you kind of learn over time how things are going to turn out. Now, you know, Aladdin for dark nebula will show me a picture that looks okay, not great, but when you image it like with my RASA, it'll turn out really nice. So I'm able to kind of judge just simply based on what we see in Aladdin. And I could be wrong. I mean, maybe there's a 0 that I've given out there that one day somebody's going to send me an image and say, "Hey, Gary, you called this one a 0, and you were a 0 for that reason. You should have called that a 3 or something." But I'll take that chance, you know, because I think most of them, and when I show you, it'll be pretty clear. Most of them, in my images or in the Sky Atlas images, you can hardly see what, you know, anything. So I'm not sure why you'd want to image that, really.
Thank you.
All right.
Gary, actually got a question for you. I'm just wondering, in the narrowband images you're taking, do you also show the strength of the actual different emission lines separately, rather than just the color combination?
Well, that's a good question. So what I tried to do that scientifically based on the subs that I was taking, but what I found is that, and I don't want to get into too much of that discussion because it's it is pretty complicated, but let's take an object, you know, for example, M8. You can't just take like the sulfur sub that you get, integrated sub, and then based on the strength of that signal, make judgments on that, because sometimes the strongest part of that signal will be in such a small area. So the aerial extent of that strong signal will be so low that it really doesn't help. So you really have to look at broader pieces across the image. So what I would do is I would put all three of those SHO on the screen, as well as the integrated SHO image, and then try to pick the parts of the individual integrated masters for SH and O that I thought were contributing, and then base it off of that signal strength. So I wasn't really looking at the graph to answer your question, but I was looking at the ADU values and trying to use that as relative comparison, you know, factoring back the efficiency of my camera and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, what I meant was more actually like having it available in the catalog, at being able to see the separate emission as well as the combination.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought of. You know, it's definitely possible because I've saved all those images that I use. So I'll give that some thought.
Excellent.
Okay, I think we're all set, Gary.
Okay, so this is the main part now. And what I'm going to do is, so Tim and Alex, can you see my screen right now, which is my file explorer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I know it's not terribly visible, but so I'm going to show you, once you download this file, I want to show you some of the key steps that you need to use. And so download the file, put it in a place that you want to keep it on your computer. Go to that file, and the Mac process, I'm going to show you Windows. The Mac is actually easier than this. But what you want to do for the downloaded file is click on it, right click on it, go to Properties, and then the first tab is General. And at the bottom of that is the security line, and there's a square that says Unblock. You want to click that Unblock because you want to enable that Excel file to be able to use all the macros in that file. Otherwise, it will not calculate the position of all the objects. So unblock that, say OK, and then launch the file. And what I'm going to do here quickly is get back to what you will see when you first launch it. So when you first, I'm going to open this again. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm going to enlarge my screen so you can hopefully see some of the data here. And I want to start kind of at a high level. And for those of you that are familiar with Excel, you'll know this. So in the upper right corner of each cell that you see a red triangle, there's a tip that you'll see upon the mouse over. So for example, here's the rating tip where I'm showing how each of them are rated. So red is good. That'll give you a tip. But what you see on my screen here, if you look closely where my cursor is all of these green triangles. Those are bad. So those green triangles are giving you warning messages that the formulas in those cells are not protected. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I was not able to protect the formulas in these spreadsheets. There's just so much going on with so many calculations that I had to leave things unprotected. So a couple of messages from that. One is, please do not erase anything that you see here, which I don't think you would do anyway. But more importantly, you don't want to see these green arrow messages all the time because the overhead it takes for them to calculate those error messages every time you update the spreadsheet is going to slow down your computer. So click on one of those cells the first time you bring this up. Click on this. You'll see a triangle with an exclamation point. Click on that. It'll take you to a box that says error checking options. And then this is the formulas part of the Excel options sheet. You go down to the bottom, and there's two here that you want to uncheck. One is called unlock cells containing formulas, and one's called formulas referring to empty cells. So you're turning off the warning messages for those two, and just say okay, and those green messages will disappear. And that way they won't pop up every time you're doing some kind of recalculation. So with that, I want to talk about how to use the spreadsheet. Now there's a quick start guide here that hopefully you can see which I'm mousing over, and that if you mouse over it, you'll be able to follow those instructions, but I'm going to take you through that verbally. So the first thing you want to do here, as you would in any kind of planning software, is put your data in. So in blue at the top left here is all of the important data that you need to input. And so you'll see that that's lat and longe, and to input your data, you just click on the cell. You can see the numbers 31, just make these numbers whatever it is for your lat and longitude. Same thing for daylight savings time. You turn that on or off depending if you're in daylight savings time or not. And then this one here is, what is your time zone relative to Greenwich Mean Time? So I've got in the mouse over, you can see some different examples there, but for wherever you live, you need to figure out what that is and put that in there. So those 4 pieces of data are about where you live. And then the other important piece is this piece here, which is the current time. And so the whole spreadsheet is going to key off of what that time is. Now I've got these up and down arrows, and every time you click up or down, it'll increment that by 1. So the first column here is the month, and the obviously the day of the month, the year, the hour, and the minute. Now, I don't use those very much because I've got these two other buttons I wanted to mention to you. One's called Now and one called Sunset. And those are the two that I use all the time. So if I click on Now, it'll just make this equal to whatever the current time on my computer is, which is now 2110. So I do use that a lot, especially during the night. If it's like, 2 or 3 a.m. and I want to see what's coming up for the next few hours, I'll click on Now. But if I want to plan on what's going on, I'll typically click on the Sunset button. That will automatically take you to whatever the sunset time is for that day. So for today, it's 1716. And you can confirm that over here. This is all the sun data. So you can see today, the dates for the sunset 1716. And as long as I'm over here, let me go through the other pieces of sun data as well. So it also shows you the nautical sunset, which is typically when you can start imaging, the nautical sunrise, and then the sunrise. Likewise, if I scroll over, you can see the moon data for today, the moon rise, the moon set, the age, the illumination, and then a pictorial of what the moon looks like. So those will all be a function of whatever this date is over here. So what I do is I just click on the sunset date if I want to have a planning session. And then the key here, right now, I've got all, if you look at this, I have to scroll over a little bit to show it, but see here, it says number of objects shown is 3135 out of 3135. So this spreadsheet right now is showing me all of the objects that I can see. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how to change that. But right now you're looking at all of the objects in the spreadsheet and they're sorted alphabetically. But the key is when you click this button called Sunset, you want to click on this button called Transit Time Sort. Because what that'll do if you click it, it'll sort all of the objects so that at the very top of the list is the one that's is overhead at this exact time, at the time that's shown in the sheet. So if I scroll over here to transit, you can see here the transit time for this object, which is this Barnard 163, is 1716, which is exactly the same as what the current time is. So if you click on Sunset and then click on Transit Time Sort, all the objects that you see starting at the top of the page here, if I scroll down, all the objects you see are going to start at the time of 716, and then you'll see as time goes on how each object will go overhead. The reason that this is important, at least for my setup, is that I may not get out here, like I won't start imaging here, like I said, until about an hour after this time, because the nautical sunset for this time of year is actually about 1816. But I may want to start imaging some of these objects that are already an hour past the meridian. So when I start imaging, this first object here will be an hour to the west. And I may want to image that because I can still get a couple of hours of imaging out of that object. I prefer, though, I would actually prefer to image some objects that are further down the list, because for my mount, I can actually image past the meridian. So if I wanted to, I could actually start imaging at the start of the night some of these objects that are further down with transit times of about 1918. So that's why I always like to do this transit time sort, so that the first object in the list here is the one that shows up at sunset. When I do that, these are the key columns to look at, the ones that are in color here, and these are the altitude for the next 6 hours. So if I take this Barnard 163, for example, at the current time, which is 716, it'll be 65 degrees, which is its maximum altitude. This column here, this AF column, shows the maximum transit altitude, which is 65 degrees. And because it's overhead right now, that's what it's at. And 2 hours from now, it'll be at 57. 2 hours from now, it'll be at 42. And 2 hours from that, 6 hours, it'll be, so this is now 2 hours from now, 4 hours from now, 6 hours from now. And those altitudes are color coded. So it's 30 degrees or less, it's going to show up in red. If it's 40 or 50 degrees, it'll show up in yellow. And if it's above 50 degrees, it'll show up in various shades of green. The greener, the better. And this all has to do with atmospheric extinction. You want to image objects that are directly overhead, or at least at a high altitude, if you can. So in terms of a quick start guide, once you sort these objects, you do a transit time sort, what you're looking for are objects, if you go down the list, that have green values, because those are going to be the ones that you can image through the least amount of atmosphere. The other part of that is how close is the moon to that object. Now, right now, as you can see, we've got about a half moon here. See that? So, and that moon doesn't come up until 2307. So right now, what this data is showing you, these are the two columns for the moon. This object has a huge separation between the object and the moon, 107 degrees. So the index, which is, these are all formulas that I kind of created and invented. But the closer it is to 100, the better. So if it's blue, if you see a blue color, that means you really don't need to worry much about the moon. Now, if I scroll down, as we go through transit times that are later in the night, let's go around midnight, you'll start seeing that these objects start getting closer to the moon and the color starts turning red. And if we get to 3 or 4 in the morning right now, you can see some of them are only, 10 or so degrees away from the moon. And those are very red. Those are not, even at a half a moon, you wouldn't want to image those. Now, this index is predicated on you using broadband filters. If you're using narrowband filters to cut out the moonlight, you can stretch this some. So even though it shows a red here, you could still image, if you had narrowband filters. But if you're using broadbands, you need to be really careful if that's a red color. So the bottom line, with your targets is you want to stick with the ones that are in the blue for the moon and in the green, if possible, for the altitude. So, that's all fine and good. But when you look at this, you still have 3,000 objects, and it's pretty overwhelming to pick any of them. Even though you see some here, you can narrow that down, but there's still a lot of objects to choose from. So there's a few ways to narrow down your object list. One is to use these ratings that we talked about. So, for example, I got to ask, well, what's a 0? Well, this SH2 123, so if I go do the mouse overs here, you can see what that looks like. There's not much there. And these mouse overs are, I think are very useful in just getting a real quick impression of what the object is. Now you can see so many of these objects here are 2s and 0s and 3s and 3s. Those generally are not objects I would recommend that you image, at least not right off if you're starting out. So what you should do is go up here to these top targets. And here, if you click on this button, it'll sort those just to show the top 2% or the top 10% or the top 25%. So let's do the top 10% and watch this number here. Right now it's 3135. If I click on just show me the top 10%, it cuts that down to 10%, which is 314. So now all you see in this column, instead of all the 0s, 1s, and 2s, and 3s, all you see are 4s and 5s. And if you just look visually, you can see that these objects are, a lot more attractive to be to be imaging than the ones that we were seeing before. So that is one way to narrow down on this list. Another way is to look at, well, where am I imaging from? So these are two filters here, the declination range and the size range, that you need to take advantage of. Now, in my case, for example, I'm in the Northern Hemisphere, so I'm going to leave the max at +90. But I know from experience, I can only image realistically down to about, so let's say -25 or so. And each of you are going to be different with respect to that number. But watch what happens when I apply that number -25. This number over here on the right goes from 314, and when I hit enter, it goes from 314 to 221. So we've knocked out 100 objects. So now, if you remember before, I had objects in this altitude table that were all, below my horizon. I couldn't see them, and now you can see they're all pretty much above the horizon, at least for now. So that's one way to narrow down the list. And then the second is the size range. So let's say you have 1,000mm focal length setup. You're not going to be able to image probably objects below maybe 2 arc minutes. I don't know, maybe you're better than that, right? But let's just say 2 arc minutes at a minimum. And you may only want to image objects that are up to maybe 90 arc minutes. So this won't narrow this down much, but let's see, it goes from 221 down to 176. So it does cut out a few of the extreme outliers in terms of minimum size. So now we've applied 3 filters. We've said only show me the top 10% of objects in the sky, only show the ones that I can see from my location, only show the ones that are big enough for my setup to be able to image. So now we can look at the list a little more with a little more judgment here and start deciding on which ones we want to image. Now, if I was looking at this image list and I had not imaged some of these other ones that are 80 degrees up, I might pick some of those because those are going to be the highest. But you also have to look at what's happening for the next 6 hours. So that just gives you a little bit of a feel for how I would go about selecting them. And now before I go, I want to, kind of jump to the next subject here, but before I do, let me stop and see if there's any questions at this point.
Let's see, I didn't see any, but let me just check. Oh, here's a question. Would it be possible to narrow the top X%? In other words, put in a selection of percent that you want to perhaps image?
Yeah, probably not because of the way that I've got the rating. Now, if I had the rating going from like 0 to 100, I could probably do that. But I've only got 6 buckets to start with, and basically the 3 buttons here, so the top 2% is a 5, and the top 10% is a 4 and a 5, and the top 20%, 25% is a 3, 4, 5. Now, let me show you something else you can do, which is pretty easy. So what I'm going to show you for the rest of our time are all of these filters across the top, but you don't have to use those. You can use the filters that Excel puts in here automatically. So I'm just going to show you, like for this rating one, if I click on that, let me clear all this first so I get all my objects back. Now, I might want to click on this, and if you click on that down arrow, you've got many different ways to filter these objects. And you may not be able to read what that says, but when you have the spreadsheet at home, just click on that down arrow. And here I can say, for example, I'm going to deselect all of them, and I'm only going to pick, let's say, the 4s, because maybe I don't want to see the 5s. I just want to see only the 4s. And then it'll just show you 4s there. Now, likewise, if I clear that, there's all kinds of utility to this, because, for example, size, you might want to see a size. I'm going to go up here to size. And I'm going to say, for the number filter, I'm going to say between, I'm going to say greater than maybe 5 and smaller than 9, which is a pretty narrow range. So this is just showing you objects that are between 5 and 9 arc minutes. And so you can use that for any of these columns. If you want to narrow down the distance and say, oh, only give me objects that are more than 1 billion miles away, or only galaxies that are bigger than 200,000 light years in diameter, you can do all kinds of that sorting. I've tried to guess across the top here with these buttons up here what you're going to want to see. But if you have a way to filter this that's not shown, you can kind of do that manually if you want.
Gary, there was another question that came up. Can objects be ranked by, I guess, surface brightness as well as size?
Yeah, so surface brightness, I got a request last year at this presentation to include that, so I have. So you'll see right here, there's surface brightness right here. Now, that's really only, most of the data that I can find on that is for galaxies. So if you want, you can go over here, like I would just click on spiral galaxy. So I click on this button here, it'll filter all the spiral galaxies out. And then I can come over to the surface brightness column over here. This is surface brightness, and I can say, well, just show me from the largest to the smallest. And now it's stuck.
So I think most people know that all those down arrows are sort buttons for that particular column.
Yeah. So hold on a second here.
There's selection buttons more than there's sort, I think.
Yeah, it's I'm going to close this down and restart it because it's having a bit of an issue here. I think I was just, doing too much at one time. So hold on a second. Let me close down a few of these windows because it is, it is pretty intensive in terms of.
Just don't close your browser window, Gary, otherwise you'll be gone.
Okay. I'm just trying to. You still with me?
We're still here.
Okay. Yeah, I hate to do all this stuff on the fly, but sometimes it's necessary.
Gary, it's a live show.
Okay, we're almost back.
What computer do you have while you're messing with that?
You know, it's a gaming computer that I got about 5 years ago. It's and I really don't even know the exact amount, exact kind it is. But getting back to your question, so what I was showing you are these with these down areas are sort of the manual sort, but that's really not the way that I designed this sheet to work. I usually up here, these up here are all of the buttons that make it easy to start with. And so, for example, if you wanted a catalog, if you just click on this drop down and you just wanted to see Messier objects, you just click on Messier and it'll bring up all the Messier objects and it'll just filter those out for you. So that's what you see here. And all you see, if you look at the total number of objects being shown now, it's 110. And all you see are Messier objects. And so these filters here are all catalogs. So you can see the Messier catalog, R, Pixin, you know, all the different catalogs that you saw in the ebook are replicated here. So any one of these you can filter by. So this is the catalog section. And then you can also filter by different types of galaxies here. You can see like spirals, ellipticals, phasons, barred. And then I have all the rings shown here, all the different star streams, all the different nebula if you want to filter for dark nebula or SHO objects. Planetary nebula if you just want to show, you know, spherical versus multipolar, and then, you know, it's globular clusters, open clusters. So all of these filters at the top that I'm showing you, an important point is that whenever you click on one, these filters do not stack. They all start fresh. So what happens if you click on one of these buttons, it'll clear all previous filters and then filter for whatever you decide to pick. The only exception to that is these top targets. So these actually do stack. And if you want to ask me why it is that way, it's just from my experimenting. This is the best way I was able to get it to work. So an example of stacking is I have all the Messier objects shown here, but maybe I just want to see the Messier objects that are in the top 2% of objects to image. So you've already got the Messier objects there. So if you click on 2%, now instead of 110 objects, I only have 14. And these are the ones that you'll probably recognize that are, you know, kind of the more famous ones in the top 2%. So these top 2% and top 10%, 25%, they will stack. So in other words, if you would pick, like if I pick this grand spiral, this will show you all the grand design spiral galaxies fresh. It'll just start everything fresh. But if I only want to maybe image the grand spiral galaxies that are in the top 2%, I can pick that out. There's only two of them, M51 and then 2442. So those, and then finally, what I wanted to point out here at the very end is kind of a catch-all. So all of the filters that I showed you up until now here are, you know, I think pretty common things like looking at open clusters. You know, so if you want to see all open clusters, you can click here, and this will bring up, you know, let's just show you how many that is. That's 216. But then this last one is a bit of a catch-all. So if you click on that, it's got a bunch of oddball categories and filters. So I've got things here like galaxies that are over 1 billion years away. I've got here galaxies with 3 arms, Magellanic galaxies, cometary nebula, you know, planetary nebula with jets, planetary nebula that have hexagon shapes. So these are all some of the more esoteric categories. I just wanted to mention that. Now, before I get too far, I did want to just go through here quickly, and before I run out of time, and I'm going to clear all these filters so I get all the objects back, and just talk briefly about, I'm going to go to the top of the page, and I'm going to sort by transit time again. Yeah, well, I got to turn this off too. Hold on a second. Okay, now I wanted to show, and I'm just gonna come up with some of the top objects here, so you can, you know, pick one that you're familiar with. Let's say M31, and so what you see here is if there's a blue link, that will take you to an Astrobin image that I have imaged. So, for example, if you click on the Seagull Nebula, if I click on that, that takes you to the Astrobin site, and you'll see the Seagull Nebula with all of the imaging data associated with that. A detailed description of the Seagull Nebula, a ton of comments, and then a map in the sky. So if you click on that very first entry there, that'll take you to an Astroman image. The second column here, if you click on it, takes you to a Sinbad link. Now, the Seagull Nebula does not have a Sinbad link, it's not shown there, but let's say this one here, which is the Rosette Nebula. If you click on this, it'll just automatically take you to the Sinbad entry for the Rosette Nebula. And this is it here for NGC 2237. Typically, Sinbad will have a lot of scientific information that may not be in my spreadsheet that you may be interested in. The third column is the Aladdin link. If you click on that, it'll bring up this graphical image from the Aladdin Sky Atlas. And the reason that this is useful is you can use this to frame your image and see what other objects may be around it that, based on your focal length and your field of view, you might be able to take advantage of. So it's just another way. The Aladdin is just another, that Sky Atlas is a nice link to automatically bring that up. These other columns, you can probably guess what they mean. And at the bottom here in the tabs, I have got a lot of explanation. I've got the user guide for this whole compendium. I've got a list of what the type of objects are, the subtypes and the classes of objects. I've got a long definition section with all definitions that I use, and then the references section. So when I go through here, like types, there's 3 different types: the nebula, the stars, and the galaxies. There's different subtypes, and then different classes. And this, for example, is where I'm showing the different nebula strengths for the HSO. So the class, what a class is different for each type of object. So for example, here, for an open cluster, the class is actually the Trumpler rating for that cluster, which is I3 200. These have to do with the concentration of that cluster and how many stars are in that cluster. But for galaxies, it's more the traditional, SB and SBBC. So these are all the galaxy ones. And for planetary nebula, it's a different convention which shows you the different compositions of gases in the planetary nebula. And that's all explained in this type, subtype, and class section at the bottom. And as I move over, you can see the size column. So this is apparent size in arc minutes of how it looks to you, the apparent size. Next column is actually the distance, and then we have the diameter. And what's important for me to explain here is that you can see different fonts, brown versus black. So if it's a brown italic font, that means it's an object in our solar system. And that means that the first one here is actually light years, and the second one is light years. If it's black, it means it's generally a galaxy that's outside our solar system. So instead of light years, it's millions of light years. And instead of light years here for diameter, it's thousands of light years. So for example, this galaxy is 50 million light years away and 90,000 light years in diameter. So my point is that the distance and diameter units change depending on what kind of object it is. And I know it's a bit confusing, and I apologize for that, but I just couldn't put so many columns in the spreadsheet to have dedicated unit columns for each object. This notes here is a brief description of the object, and I've got right ascension, declination. These are all self-explanatory. The last thing that I wanted to show before I take some more questions is, as we move to the right here, is this thing called My Section. So I gave you a section here for you to put your own notes in. So My Notes is free form. You can put whatever you want into that column for each object. But priority is coded. So if you put a 1 or a 2 or a 3 there, it'll be red, yellow, or green, depending on the number you put in. And you can use that however way you want. You can use that to show you the objects that are your highest priorities to image. I use it to differentiate between the different kinds of setups I have. So I have my RASA setup is my 1, and my C11 setup is my 2, for example. And I've got another setup, my baby Q for 3. You can do it that way. You can use those priority tags however you want. And then the My Status is the status of your imaging. So if you're finished with it, you put an F in there and it'll gray it out. If it's in the middle of being imaged, it's an I, which is the diagonal lines. And if you're just planning to image it, it's the dotted. And I explain all of this here in the mouse overs at the top. So that My Section is your section as the user to help you know which objects you plan to image and which objects you want to image and the status of that. So with that, I think I will just take another pause here to see if there's any more questions that have come up.
There's a couple. Let me just read them as they came up. How do you handle objects that are in more than one catalog?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a very frustrating thing to deal with. So if I scroll to the right here, what you see are these, I haven't talked about this yet, but each column is a different catalog. So you can see, I start with NGC and the number below, so I've got mouse overs here to talk about all this, but I do have to be at the top of the sheet. The number immediately below is the number of objects that I have in the spreadsheet. So for example, there's 1,443 NGC objects. So you can see as I scroll to the right, we got NGC, IC, the Herschel 400. So these are all different catalogs, and you don't have to use these buttons up here. Remember I showed you the button up here, which was basically the catalog button. That's kind of the easy way to do it, but the brute force way to do it is just come over here and let's say, you know, you just wanted to see the VDB objects, you know, you would just say, well, you know, show me, well, I've got to take off, I've got to clear the filters because the VD objects don't show up as the highest class of objects to image. So, and then I can go over here and I can just say, you know, select all the VDBs and leave off anything that's not. So the only thing that's going to show me are the VDBs. And to answer your question, you can see as I scroll to the left, some of these have multiple entries. So VDB 9 actually shows up as LDN 643 and LDN 1355 as well. The tough part is what, for every object, it has to have a primary name. So if an object has multiple names, what name do I use as the primary? And that was tough. I just tried to use what I would call like the most common designation for an object, which is typically like a Messier designation. But if you look at, you know, the Messier object or any of these objects, for example, they'll all have multiple, you know, almost all the galaxies have these PGC designations and a lot have UGC. So you can see there's a lot of multiple designations. And if you can't find an object, let's say you're looking for, you know, let's say NGC 190 right here, well, I actually have that under Hickson. So if there's an NGC object that is out there that you're trying to find, instead of, and you don't find it in the first column, all you have to do is sort this NGC column, just say, you know, smallest to largest, and then you're going to have all the NGC objects that are in this sheet sorted. And if you look over on the left side, even though the NGC objects are sorted, sometimes they show up as ARP objects, sometimes they show up as Messier objects. So that's the trick. You know, it's not hard to handle multiple category designations in these columns to the right. But then what do I show on the left? Because if you came in here looking for Messier 110, but you were looking at it, you know, under NGC 205, that would be a problem. So I try to alleviate that to some extent, but there's always going to be that issue of confusion.
Oh, Gary, remind us, how do you clear all your filters?
Yeah, so it's the clear all button. There's two buttons here, so that's a great question. If you say clear all, it'll clear all of, literally, it'll clear all of them. And the way you'll know that, it's back to 3135. But oftentimes, you know, especially if I've messed with these, let's say, you know, if I go back to my minimum of, you know, minus 30, for example, and if I, you know, put a minimum here of 5, and so I've applied that, so now I've got a subset shown. I don't want to clear all the filters. So if I apply a filter now, let's say I apply, you know, I just want to look at collisional ring galaxies, and it'll bring all those up, and you can see those. Well, it's showing none because all the collision ring galaxies are smaller than, so I have to change that back to 0. So let me put that back to 0. So it'll show me 20 collisional ring galaxies now. But if I want to clear that, if I say clear all, it'll clear both of these. So normally, instead of clearing all, I say clear all except the declination and size. And because I've blown this up so much, you can't see the word size there. But this top button clears everything except it keeps these two filters the same. So if I clear this, you can see that this won't be 3135. It'll be less than that because it does keep this first filter applied. But to answer your question, it's the two black ones are the clear filters. So, I tried to color code it. So black is the clear filters, red are the top target filters.
And I think you covered this before. Where's the relative narrowband spectral information?
Yeah, so I only did that, I'm currently working on it for planetary nebula, because I think that would be useful as well. But if you go over here and you just say, show me all basically the emission nebula or the show nebula, I guess before I do that, this is always the challenge. I'm just going to say clear all, because sometimes I'll have filters that have been applied, like my deck filter, and then all the emission nebula won't show up. So I'm just going to clear all, and I'm going to bring all these show nebula up here. So these are the emission nebula. And you can see I only was able to put the channel estimations for the objects that I have imaged. So especially the southern hemisphere objects that are deep in the southern hemisphere, which you don't even see a link to my image because I don't have those. Those are just sky atlas images. I'm not able to show the ratio, but I do have them for almost all of the northern hemisphere objects, like the Sol Nebula and the Fish Head and the Heart and so on. So it shows up in the class column. And the class, like I tried to explain before, the class is a bit of a catch-all. It'll show, for example, for galaxy clusters, it'll show the number of galaxies. And for galaxies themselves, spiral galaxies, it'll show the designation of the spiral galaxy. So the class is it changes depending on what the object is.
There's lots of commentary, but I think those are all the questions. There was one question, it's probably a comment. So if I understand the way the filters work, the spreadsheet does not allow simultaneous filter from +2 criteria like globs and Caldwell objects.
Yeah, and it's kind of a sore spot with me, because I actually started this off with that intent that you could just stack as many filters as you want. But without getting into the guts of how the programming works, it's very hard to keep those filters applied, especially when you're combining them with these deck and size range filters. It just gets to be very complex. So the answer to the question is, if it's any of these brown filters across the top, anytime you click on one of those, as well as this galaxy drop down, it'll just start everything from scratch. So you cannot, for example, say, well, I want to look at grand design spiral galaxies and the ones that have BB rows. You can't do that. So it's a bit of a source of frustration. I wish you could do that. The only exception, like I explained, is these top targets. You can, let's say click on elliptical galaxies and then just say, well, I just want to see elliptical galaxies that are in the top 10% of targets. And there's not many, because elliptical galaxies aren't that much fun to image, but there are a couple.
And there's another question came up. Any thoughts about linking to a technical description of the target, like a wiki or history of astronomical discovery? This could
that's an interesting idea.
Unfortunately,
for so many of these objects, that would definitely be a nice thing for the, what I would say, quote, the attractive objects, the ones that have quite a bit of study in. But the majority of these are objects that really have not been studied that much. But that is an interesting idea, and that's something I'll definitely consider. And that is a link to kind of more depth of not just wiki, but there's a lot of interesting websites out there that gather a lot of data on these, especially like the Messier objects and some of the more attractive objects out there. So that's an interesting idea. And one point I'll make here is, if you're just interested in imaging, and I think most of the people that are watching are they're not just having pretty pictures. If all you're interested in having pretty pictures, you don't need to have all this detailed information. All you really need, if you want pretty pictures, is these two columns I started with, which is like the altitude and the moon. A lot of this stuff, like how far it is away, how big is it, the size, the class, a lot of that, like, for example, this M61, the fact that these are the different designations that show the arm structures and all of the different letters here. By the way, if you want to know like what FKZ is, you just have to go to types, and you can see F means it's a phaeton galaxy, and Z indicates it's a barred galaxy. So all of the designations are here. You probably don't need to know all that if all you're interested in is taking a few pretty pictures. So a lot of what I've tried to include here, it's probably, you know, it's definitely, you know, more for the, I would say, the serious imager that wants to maybe understand a little bit more about what they're imaging. You know, so for example, for these Hickson clusters, which I find to be really interesting, if you look at the ebook I showed you before, where it showed all the Hickson clusters, about half those clusters are true clusters and half aren't true clusters. The other half that aren't true clusters means the galaxies are just at different distances, and they're not really part of the same birth process there. So that kind of stuff's not that important for a lot of people, but I put a lot of that in the compendium here just because I think for people that take this hobby seriously, they enjoy learning more about the objects and trying to find out more about, you know, it's fun for me, for example, to go to the spiral galaxy button. So let's look at all these spiral galaxies, and just to say, well, you know, what are the, by distance here, and or by diameter, what are the largest, you know, spiral galaxies that I can image? And you can see there's some spirals out there that are 200-300 light years in diameter, and you're able to image those. And you can see, you know, we have some of these have been imaged, and it's now that, you know, to the common public, they probably don't care that these are massive, you know, 250,000 light years in diameter, but I find that to be, you know, interesting myself, that these objects that are just so huge in size. And the same thing with the clusters. You know, it's kind of fun to just look at, let's say, just look at galaxy clusters. So you come over here to the galaxy clusters, which are right here. And then you say to yourself, well, let's just look at clusters that are over 1 billion light years away. So you sort this from largest to smallest. And, you know, you can see you've got some out here that are 1 or 2 billion light years. So that's, you know, I kind of enjoy that, just knowing that. But again, that's not something that people really need to know. Now, this brings up another point somebody's going to probably identify, and that is the diameter here is also, it changes. So for clusters, this is not the diameter of the largest galaxy. This is actually the diameter of the cluster itself. So if it's underlined, that's the nomenclature here, that if it's underlined, it's actually to the diameter of the cluster. And I tried to show a lot of this in the mouse over, you know, the red triangles there. I tried to show that where it's important. And likewise, the size is not the size of a galaxy in that cluster. It's the size of a circle that would encompass the whole cluster. And I think that's important, because if you've got a setup, you need to know that, well, this cluster is 10 arc minutes in diameter. That way, that might be too small for you actually to get any kind of realistic detail on. You know, this one here is 1.4 arc minutes in diameter. That is really small. So you don't even want to, you know, attempt this one. If I click on that to bring up the Astrobin link, you know, you can just see how small that is. You don't even want to attempt that one unless you've got a pretty high focal length system.
Gary?
Yeah.
Alan Brunel a little while ago asked, can the priorities be expanded but to include some more numbers and things? And it brought up a question in my mind. Well, I think I know the answer to this. This is a big spreadsheet with lots of macros in it, right?
Oh man, thousands of lines of macros. Yeah.
Yeah. Just if you want to change something in the spreadsheet, you open up Excel and change something. And if he wanted to make it, you know, make 1,000 different values or anything, if he wanted to add objects or take away objects, he could do any of that. It's a spreadsheet, and you could do any of that stuff.
Well, and that was
in theory.
That was part of the point in leaving it unprotected as well. So, you know, just so people know, there's no problem with deleting however many rows you want to delete or adding rows. That's fine. I would be careful though deleting columns, because at the top of the spreadsheet behind these first 5 or 9 rows are a bunch of hidden formulas. So don't delete any of the columns. Now, I know Alan really well, so hello, Alan, and thanks for tuning in. And so I think that you're right, Tim. You could edit this, you know, however you wanted to edit it, with how many different categories. But it's interesting for me to hear what somebody like Alan is thinking, because that gets my wheel turning about, you know, maybe there is room for you know, more a fine gradation of the rating system, for example. You know, I could have easily, you know, gone from like I said, 0 to 100. I felt though that I was pretty, I mean, it was a judgment call for some of these, especially the zeros and ones. And, you know, to get to your point, Tim, I wasn't sure if Alex or Tim made that point, but if I clear all of these, for example, and I just say, well, just show me all the objects that are 0. You know, there's not a ton of them, but, you know, like, for example, one of them is the Hubble Deep Field. So if any of you, like me, have tried to image them. So you can see here, I have actually imaged some of these objects, the ones that have the blue links, and a lot of the Barnard I haven't, but I have the sky images. And you can see, you know, some things show up. So like if I click on this, this is an image I took of Barnard 73. Well, it actually doesn't, it actually is yeah, I don't even know where 73 is right in the middle lower part there, you know. Now, why somebody would want to image that one, I don't know, but you know, at least that one does show up. So you can see a lot of these are Barnard, a lot of them are sharp lists. So some of the sharp lists, they just don't have a lot of definition. So I'm sure people could quibble with, and like this Dwingaloo 2, I never even found where that one was. So some people can quibble with that, but I think generally, you know, the point is if you have limited time and you're trying to focus on the priority objects, you probably don't want to look at the zeros or the ones. That would be my point.
Hey, Gary, this is Tim. Jeff made a comment about he feels like he owes you something for this. And I know that you mentioned this earlier, but maybe you could just, you know, point folks to your scholarship fund as I think the way that you would like for folks to pay you back on some of this work. If you want to just talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So let me just, if you download any of these documents, it's in both the spreadsheet and in the PDF. But there is a link. There is a link to take you to the scholarship fund. It's right here in the beginning. And if you click on that, it's and for those of you that aren't familiar with it, bold.org. Let me just like give a recommendation to that site because for no fee they will set up a fund for you. The catch is that all of the money that they collect has to go to that fund. Has to go. You know, it's not like GoFundMe. GoFundMe, you could ask for $4,000 and turn around and buy a car, I think, but you know, it's all goes to the recipients, and the processing fees, administration fees are paid through contributors, and their main goal is to try to make it, you know, easier for students to go to college, easier for them to find funding. So bold.org is, at least from what I've seen so far, a good place to set up different funds if you want to, you know, just for a given school, set up a fund. But that, to give you Tim, just to answer that question, those links are there, and obviously, you know, I'm not looking to get a ton of money here, but just something that we can maybe reward a few college students each year for that.
And Gary, this is a federally established 403B or something like that.
Yeah, yep. And that was important for me to make sure that it was that. What is that? I mean, it says right on the site there, whatever I showed you. It's
Can't quite see
it's
it.
deductible,
Okay.
but it's also, yeah, whatever that 501, you know, okay, whatever that is.
Yeah. Okay. Which for those of us, or for those outside the country, that means it's tax deductible. We can take that off the top of our income as one of our taxes, assuming you can work out all the other tax things that go on in life. So.
One more thing I'll add is that you'll see a bunch of U's in here. That just means unknown, because, you know, especially for some of these dark nebulae and so on, it's just really hard to get a good distance measurement on that. And without distance, I can't really tell, you know, what the diameter is on that. So, but that's, you know, probably about all I had planned to talk to. I hope, you know, people find it to be a useful tool, and over time, please provide me feedback, because that's how we got to this point. I never intended for it to be as kind of broad and have as many features as it does, but people kept asking for things. Like I said, last year they asked for surface brightness for orientation and so on. And orientation I was able to get. Surface brightness I put in here. I would say, you know, just to add an aside here, I'm still uncomfortable with with visual magnitude and surface brightness. And the only reason I'm uncomfortable with those is that it seems like those numbers vary quite a bit depending on what source I go to. So I'm not terribly confident in those numbers, but it's the best I could. And you can see where I got those from. In this case, for the magnitudes, there was a good website here that has by TAIC, and I did contact him and ask if it was okay that I use those magnitudes here, and he said it was okay. But I just don't have a tremendous amount of confidence in the magnitudes. And the same actually goes for the distances. So you just have to take all that with a grain of salt and know that those probably aren't, exactly right in some cases. But that's kind of the best we've got at this point in time.
You can stop sharing when you're done, Gary.
Okay.
Well, Gary, thank you so much. I can just tell you, and I know you weren't watching the comments as you were giving your presentation, but there certainly were a lot of comments with folks talking about how great this is and how excited they are, and even one comment where someone was building one of their own, and they said, "Well, I guess I can stop doing that now." So I think.
Well, there's nothing like putting something together yourself, and I would say this though: if you're putting it together with the intent of trying to sell it, then yeah, that's probably not going to work. I may have dashed some of those dreams for a few people. I don't know, but I had no interest in trying to make money off of this. I just, we're a community, and so many people have helped me over the years. Just holding my hand to learn all of this, and all of you that are looking at me here on the screen, you know how hard it is. So it's just nice to try to make it a little bit easier for us folks to do that. It's a tough hobby. It really is a tough hobby.
Gary, at the end of the show,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric. You were going to do the same thing as I am. Go ahead.
Yeah, at the end of the show, we have a little chat afterwards. You're welcome to stay and
it'd be great.
Join us.
I'm sorry, you're not going to do the same thing as I am. Isaac had a question that kind of trickled in at the end there, and so he was wondering about the processing for your images, and are they processed similarly? Without going into too much depth, maybe you can speak to that very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I think processing. I'm a very, I like to think I was an engineer before I retired, and I kept. Part of as a research engineer, you're kind of indoctrinated into following very kind of rigid processes and procedures. Astrophotography is not like that. I kept, I could show it to you. I kept I kept the Word document that's, this is my procedure for processing astrophotography documents, and it's over 100 pages, and it's a complete mess right now. It's just a disaster. So, I definitely, I use PixInsight, and I use a few other tools. I use Photoshop to some extent, and I use Lightroom to store all of my images, and Lightroom has some interesting sort of masks and filters as well. But I would say, the basic processing has always been the same in PixInsight, but where it gets to be different now, especially with my Rasa setup, where I'm collecting a ton of light, is a lot of the tools that we have recently for noise suppression and for sharpening, especially like the BlurX tools from Russell, those have really changed the game. And so my processing hasn't, changed that much over the years, but I think we all have to always keep our eyes open for what may be helpful and what may really kind of take our images to the next level. And so I'm always looking for that.
Gary?
Yeah.
I might have the wrong person. I mean, I do this every Sunday night, but I think you told us in one of your earlier presentations that you don't spend all that much time on the telescope for each of these objects, that you tend to take, you don't spend 3 to 4 nights gathering information for one shot, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of, I guess I have a reputation for not having a lot of time, and I don't know what to think about that. I'm just a very impatient person, and so I can't sit back. I just don't like getting 50 hours or 80 hours. I'm sure the image would be fantastic, but I do think with the processing that we have these days that I can use 2 hours or 5 hours or 10 hours and get a pretty darn good image. And the way I look at it is, if I'm spending, you know, my next 10 hours, do I spend that getting incrementally more data, or do I spend that getting a completely new object? And when I do the comparisons, I just get more personal satisfaction from maybe not having the highest quality image in the world, which is why I've taken my name out of, you know, the Astrobin Awards and all that. But I like seeing different things. I like, and that's, you know, that's why I've got 2,200 different images. I love to see new objects and obscure objects and distant objects. So I'm really more about kind of the discovery and the exploration than I am about some of my friends out there who just spend a lot of time getting a wonderful, fantastic image. So yeah, I don't really know how to explain it. It's more, you have to do what's true to yourself and what you love and what you enjoy. And I just love seeing new things.
Thank you. Well, that certainly was wonderful. Thank you, Gary, again for all of your work and for sharing this with the community, and certainly thank you for coming here and talking with us all about it tonight. So
Yeah,
I really
my pleasure.
appreciate it. And unless we have anything else,
Oh, wait a minute. There is something I want to say.
Yeah.
Terry was doing a heck of a job tonight. He had Gary's information was sometimes a little small for you, and you don't realize it by the time you saw it. Terry had completely changed what he was broadcasting. So Terry, thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Terry.
No problem.
yes,
Thanks.
absolutely.
Okay, cheers.
All right.
Take us out.
Okay. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Have a good
All
night.
right. Good night, everyone.
Bye.